Richard Montgomery affirms the resolution. As a definition, permanent members on the UN Security Council include the US, Russia, China, England, and France, and are called the P5. The defining aspect of these countries is that they have unilateral veto power on the Council. Thus, our sole contention is about that veto power. The UN right now is in the midst of a legitimacy crisis. Absent structural reform, the Security Council is terminally in gridlock. Subpoint A is legitimacy. Writer 23 explains that in terms of maintaining peace and security, the UN's track record has been dismal, from dithering over apartheid in South Africa to Iraq, Rwanda, Yemen, the 2008 financial crisis, and now COVID-19. Crucially, gridlock decreases legitimacy. UN 24 explains that under international law, the UNSC is the sole global body that can authorize force, but the P5 has a veto that allows it to unilaterally thwart any action. By design, the UNSC cannot address some of the biggest issues of war in the world when one of its permanent members is a party to the conflict. For example, the Council on Foreign Relations writes that Russia has used its veto power nearly 20 times to block resolutions aimed at holding the Bashar al-Assad regime accountable for war crimes. Thus, the UN 23 writes that without structural reform, the performance and legitimacy of the Council will continue to suffer, and so will the credibility and relevance of the United Nations itself. Thus, Walter 21 explains that there have been no new peacekeeping missions from 2014, despite an increase in global conflict. If the UN is ineffective, its role for preserving global peace is massively weakened. Herd 08 writes, being seen as legitimate increases the likelihood that states will respect the decisions it makes, including implementing economic sanctions, peace missions, or to accept ceasefires. A loss of legitimacy is disastrous. As Taylor 23 confirms, over 238,000 people died in global conflict last year, a 96% increase in deaths related to conflicts. Subpoint B is Ukraine. According to UN 24, all 5 permanent members have exercised the right of veto at one time or another. Dial 23 explains that when Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, its permanency at the UN Security Council killed all prospect of multilateral action. Russia, exercising its privileges as a permanent member, immediately and unilaterally vetoed a ceasefire, and the year since Russia's invasion has only strengthened an already widespread consensus on how broken the UNSC is, with subsequent calls for change gathering real momentum. Thus, the impact is a long war. Norton 24 estimates that those killed in the Russia-Ukraine conflict have neared 500,000 people. Subpoint C is Israel. Odell 24 explains that the US has vetoed resolutions critical of Israel on more than any other council member, 45 times as of December 18, 2023. The US has vetoed 89 Security Council resolutions in total since 1945, meaning slightly over half of its vetoes have been used on resolutions critical of Israel. Letterer 24 writes that the United States vetoed a widely supported resolution demanding an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas war in a 13-to-1 vote. And according to Ugaiwe 17, as long as Israel continues to get aid from the United States, along with its veto support at the UN Security Council, there's no incentive for the Israeli government to negotiate for a peace deal. The US diplomatic monopoly continues to serve as the single most means to accomplish Israel's goals, and thus the impact is a humanitarian crisis. Crucially, as a result of the war, Melvin 24 writes that Gaza's 2.4 million people are on the brink of famine. The world is urging the UN Security Council to pass an urgent ceasefire resolution in Gaza. Because the veto continues to destroy solutions to global conflicts, we are proud to affirm.
All right, if everybody's ready, I'll start. We negate. Our first contention is foreign aid. Scenario 1 is the United States. The U.S. is key to funding foreign aid in the UN. CFR 24 finds that the United States remains the largest donor to the United Nations, accounting for 1/3 of funding for the body's collective budget. Biden has affirmed the United Nations' importance to U.S. foreign policy and increased funding. Crucially, U.S. support is the price we pay for a permanent seat at the table. Patrick 22 finds that in return for serving as custodians of the world order, permanent members were granted prerogative of blocking any UN enforcement action, the price that the United States insisted upon accepting this new security arrangement. The Charter for Negotiation could empower nationalists who advocate abandoning the body to chart a more isolationist course. Otherwise, the impact is hunger. Schaefer 23 finds that the U.S. provided 50% of all contributions to the World Food Program, and every dollar matters, as Relief Web 23 finds that every 1% cut in food assistance risks pushing more than 400,000 people towards the brink of starvation. Scenario 2 is Japan. Tokyo utilizes foreign aid to garner support for permanent UNSC membership. A non-22 finds that Japan has worked at obtaining a permanent seat at the UNSC, a cornerstone of its foreign policy since the 1980s. At this time, Japan overtook the US as the largest giver of development assistance. Indeed, that's been the impetus behind new development aid to Africa. Javon's 22 finds that Japan has made an aggressive attempt to regain diplomatic influence in Africa, announcing $30 billion in contributions. In this time of crisis, Japan was going back to basics in its partnership with Africa in a long-term project to reform the UNSC to become a permanent member. Indeed, Pajon 17 finds that gathering support of the 54 countries for reform of the UNSC has been Japan's first political priority in Africa for years. Eliminating permanent membership stifles Japanese contributions, and past empirics prove. Shinichi 22 finds that Japan has long called for Security Council reform to become a permanent member. In 2005, there was a chance of this happening. However, the endeavor ended in failure, and the intervening years, Japan saw its financial contributions fall, giving way to China. There are two impacts. First is poverty. Japanese aid outflows are crucial, as Addison 15 notes that Japan's infrastructure investment can lift millions out of poverty. The second impact is hegemony. Japanese aid is key to counter Chinese influence, as Xiao 22 finds that Tokyo can compete with Beijing on infrastructure financing and offer an alternative development model, quality projects which are transparent in nature, and partnerships with African nations. Otherwise, head shift, as Hickson 24 finds that China's goal in Africa is to challenge Western supremacy on the international stage and build relationships with non-aligned African countries, prompting them to promote Chinese foreign policy. This would have resulted in great power war, as Keck 14 finds that China's rise carries significant risks, and hegemonic transition periods have historically been the most destabilizing eras. The rise of new global powers necessitates revisions to the rules of the world. Contention 2 is democracy. After a period of backsliding, global democracy is rebounding, as Sir Hard 23 finds that there may be a cause for optimism. 34 countries saw improvements, and the world's long freedom recession may be bottoming out. However, China is trying to woo developing nations in the UN towards authoritarianism. Hansberry 23 finds that Xi's goal appears to be to overwhelm the US by creating a larger bloc of supporters within the global south. He can outvote the US and the UN to repurpose them to advance his own aims. That strategy has become apparent in BRICS. More members increasingly rely on Chinese economic support, and China has become the dominant player in the global south with far larger diplomatic influence. And USP5 membership is key to preserving democracy, as Hopkins and Stoll 22 find that Biden signaled a renewed interest in engaging with the United Nations as a permanent member of the Security Council. The United States plays an integral role in deliberations and influence over which items move forward. Priorities include addressing rising authoritarianism, and the United States views the Security Council as a platform to respond to disinformation, aggressive action, and human rights violations. This is critical, as Farquhar 17 finds that during the 20th century, citizens of several nations lived for a time under extreme, brutal, and oppressive regimes. Between them, these states killed more than 100 million people. Thus, we negate.
Can I have the evidence on Japan, just the link evidence?
Yeah.
Can I also get the evidence that China is able to rally countries in the global south?
Do you guys just want the speech doc?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, yeah, sure.
As long as it has cut cards.
Yeah. I'll send it in the chat and in the email chain. All right, cool. Sent.
All right. In that case, are you good for cross?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right. Let's start on democracy, right? So you tell me that the US prioritizes keeping engagement with the UN to prevent human rights violations. Why is that not still an incentive regardless of the veto?
Why is that not an incentive? Sorry, what was your question?
Why isn't that an incentive outside of the veto?
Yeah, so outside of, it's not like that their incentives change. It's kind of like the UN is kind of a tool that the US uses to fight authoritarianism. Yes, like America might still want to fight authoritarianism, but we'd say that they don't have the tool, which is the UN.
Wait, can I have a follow-up then?
Yeah.
So then how successful has the UNSC been at, like, for example, preventing genocide in Xinjiang?
I mean, obviously, like the UN can't stop every instance of genocide, but overall, we say that the UN
Wait,
and
that's
the US.
That's not my question, right? The answer is they haven't been successful because China's permanent membership itself prevents them from taking any action.
Yeah, but okay, so yeah, again, like obviously the UN and the US can't stop every instance of oppression or maybe genocide, but we say that overall, it's like the US has been pretty successful in solving for authoritarianism and disinformation and human rights violations. We've been on this for a pretty long time. I'll take a question. Let's talk about your argument on legitimacy. So you say that gridlock is kind of like leading to like the death is kind of bad for legitimacy. So how is this like, when is this legitimacy crisis actually going to like, when is like the impacts going to happen?
The impacts of what? The decrease in legitimacy?
Yeah.
Well, I would say it's already happening now, insofar as you see so many wars that aren't able to be stopped since the veto prevents the UNSC from taking action. So like Ukraine, Gaza, Syria, Xinjiang, all of those are examples of the impacts happening right now.
Wait. Specifically in the example of Ukraine, so if a veto, like a resolution for a ceasefire would be passed, how do you know that Russia's going to listen? How do you know that Russia's going to stop invading Ukraine just because the UN told them to stop?
Well, they're not going to stop invading Ukraine. What the UN does by ordering a ceasefire is that they send peacekeepers there. They send their military there in order to keep a ceasefire. Let's talk about Japan and soft power, right? So insofar as them giving aid to Africa is a massive reason to spread hegemony, why wouldn't they do that outside of the Security Council?
Because they have no incentive to. That's the entire argument.
Wait, but your entire argument tells me that Japan always wants to spread hegemony, correct?
No, that's not like it's not like the end goal. Like their end goal is to kind of get into the UNSC and get a permanent seat on the UNSC. However, if we abolish that, then there's no incentive for Japan to give aid because they're not going to get a seat on the UNSC.
Okay, that's fine. That's cross.
All right.
Okay. Structure of the speech is going to go down their case and then weighing at the end. All right. Is everyone ready? Perfect. That case, my time begins now. Start on their first contention about foreign aid. At the top, the P5 countries such as the US and Japan will continue to assist the UN for two reasons. First, UN peacekeeping operations are cost efficient, as Mayor 18 finds they're 8 times more cost effective for the US to financially support a UN peacekeeping mission than to deploy it through the US forces domestically. But second is soft power. As Darrenbrook 28 finds, countries increase support for UN peacekeeping aligns with improving international prestige by enhancing its image as a responsible nation on a peaceful rise, which is why you're always going to see that aid and peacekeeping will happen in their world. But second, realize that the P5 are not the biggest contributors to aid anyways, as UN 21 reports that Germany contributes more than 3 of the P5 members. But then, third, aid is actually going to increase in their world for a couple of reasons, or our world. First, when you remove permanent membership, then the P5 have to actually try and get elected to the council. And fortunately for us, every single P5 country is still going to want to be a part of the UN, as they're still able to exert some of their foreign policy goals. That means that they have to contribute more in aid in order to look good to the rest of the countries and get their vote. But second, other countries of the UN who are now more represented now have an incentive to contribute more because A, they want to get elected, and B, they're more incentivized to participate because their vote is held equal to everyone else's. There's no longer 5 countries who can squash their vote with just a veto. So the comparative is between 5 countries potentially decreasing their funding by a little versus the other 190 other countries and the P5 increasing theirs. But specifically on the US, Biden isn't going to lash out about losing veto power. He already agrees to limit veto power. He supports reform. On Japan, 2 responses. First, Japan will actually be incentivized to be a part of the UNSC and increase aid when you remove permanent membership because, again, they realize that there's an equal vote. They do not have to be a permanent member in order to further their national policy interests. They can do that by having an equal vote. Second, we can get rid of this Chinese hegemony that our opponents are so worried about by removing their permanent membership and their veto power, which allows them to get away with anything they want. But go on to their second argument about democracy. First, their Sirhar evidence right after the sentence they quote about 34 countries seeing improvements says 35 countries lost ground, and that represents the narrowest margin recorded between countries since the downward trend began 17 years ago. And that's because China and Russia are increasing being emboldened and vetoing everything like stopping the genocides. But second, their Hansberry 23 evidence just says China is trying to get more votes amongst supporters in the global south, but not that it's actually happening. When you look at the GA, you see most of the time these countries follow democratic countries like the US and support things such as stopping the war in Ukraine. But third, we would argue that permanent membership is causing the democratic backsliding because China and Russia can A, push for their authoritarian agenda, and B, stop any democratic efforts stopping them. That means that their whole impact about Chinese hegemony can keep exploiting countries in the global south and in Africa and turn them authoritarian with debt traps because the UNSC can't stop them. China's genocide in Myanmar is still happening for that exact reason. But on to some weighing. Right now, realize it's a try or die for the UN. It's failing right now. Reform by voting Aff is the only way we risk saving it. Second, look at the historical precedent. Conflicts like Syria, Myanmar, Ukraine, and Israel have not seen a resolution because of the veto. Russia has vetoed Syrian resolutions 22 times, and in Israel, 45 times. But lastly, we solve for infinitely many conflicts in the future by creating an effective UNSC able to pass resolutions for aid and ceasefires. It's a clean vote for the Aff.
Can I see some evidence?
Yeah.
All right. Can I see the evidence on elections? That
A is going to increase because of elections?
Yeah.
Oh, those were analytics.
Okay. Actually, yeah, I don't think if that was an analytic, that's pretty much all I needed, but that's fine then. I'll take prep. I'll raise my hand when I get on the call with Aaron. That's when prep starts. All right, that was 2 minutes. It's gonna be our case, their case. Hold up. Time begins now. We're going to go for democracy, concede all the defense. We can kick out of the turns on C1. On democracy, first to tell you that 35 countries lost ground. Our evidence, they're misunderstanding our evidence. Our evidence is saying that the rate of democratic backsliding is going down because the United States is able to keep countries under the democratic sphere of influence insofar as they're still part of the P5. Then they tell you that Yeah, then they tell you that more countries are actually following democracy. And we're saying that, yeah, China is trying to woo countries into authoritarianism, but the only reason they're not able to do that because the U.S. is able to exert influence over these countries because they're a P5 member. Those countries who are neighboring countries of China end up going to China after the P5 because otherwise the United States doesn't have as much influence over them because these countries are right next to China. Then we're talking about debt trap and genocide. That's not unique. China will still be doing stuff to the BRI and still be doing genocide within their own country. It doesn't matter. Plus, we would say that even if China gets kicked off the permanent membership and there's resolutions against China for the genocide and the debt trap, they just probably defy it, and it would just hurt the legitimacy of the United Nations. Now on their case, on gridlock, regulations check back for gridlock. Dale 23 finds that when the UNSC's gridlock delegates in the GA build support for resolutions that condemn P5 for obstruction as they have done in Syria, Ukraine, Israel, and Palestine. The UN General Assembly has also established new mechanisms for holding the UNSC to account, which means that when a veto has happened, it's actually reviewed by the General Assembly to make sure whether the veto is like liable or not. Then on legitimacy, first turn, UN collapse. Loss of veto will lead to defiance and irrelevance of the United Nations. That's the best link to legitimacy because if countries aren't actually listening to the United Nations, it's more irrelevant because of like the loss of veto power, especially large countries with the most power. That's going to hurt legitimacy the most. Roth 19 writes that ignoring the veto may mean that the resolution ends up being ignored by states. That would make the council irrelevant, if not dangerous. Bosco 12 furthers that you cannot have Security Council without the P5. Major powers will not grant an international body binding legal authority unless they're certain that it will not prejudice their interests. The alternative to veto is no Security Council. That means that large powers will not care. They will not give UN the ability and the authority to govern global affairs if they're not given the veto power, which means that UN ends up becoming completely irrelevant and collapses. Three-way mechanisms. First prerequisite, because their arguments completely rely on UNSC existing. If the UNSC collapses, then their impacts can't happen. But then second, on scope, the L20 finds that in an era of waning multilateralism, efforts to revise the UN Charter is more likely to kill most existing structures of multilateral cooperation than to produce a more just institution. It's not going to be easy to revise the UN Charter, and there's going to be a lot of nuances and implications. That's likely to stifle multilateralism in an era where multilateralism is already waning. But then on probability, Leigh Philippard 94 confirms that American interest in the UN declined in 1960s when it found itself constantly outvoted. The emergence of a situation in which the U.S. might find itself regularly outvoted in a Security Council where its veto might again result in distancing itself from the organization. The United States is primarily in the United Nations is able to control the organization. If we're not able to control and have a significant influence, we see zero benefit actually being in the organization, and that's why we stray away. So their legitimacy impacts actually work for us. Then you can turn on, go to Ukraine. They cherry pick their examples. Swarthmore 17 finds that on 90% of conflict, the council has no trouble agreeing. And second, if you affirm, then Russia would probably just disobey any resolution in Ukraine. On Israel, first, their ceasefire was already passed. Kelman 24 explains that UNSC voted 14-0 in favor of resolution demanding ceasefire in Gaza. That means that we're already solving. Second, no enforcement mechanism for ceasefire. Sherbin 24 finds that Israel announced a large-scale Israeli military offense 2.5 weeks after the UN Security Council ceasefire in Gaza, which means that even if there's a ceasefire, Israel isn't listening. They don't care. The war's still going to happen. Third, aid inflows to Gaza have been increasing. Drop that. Fourth, U.S. veto is the only way to get Israel back down. America shields Israel with permanent membership. Although movie finds that U.S.'s veto resolutions critical of Israel 45 times. Over half of its vetoes have been used in resolutions critical of Israel. U.S. influence over Israel is key. Kokari 23 writes that Biden's tried to balance support of Israel with message of restraint. He has pressed Israel to follow laws in war and secured an Israeli agreement to allow aid. Pressing for Israeli restraint may be the key to mitigating the humanitarian crisis and preventing Iran from emerging the winner in the war. That means that the United States. Are you ready for cross?
We're gonna take prep before cross.
All right.
Kat, how much prep do you want? We'll take
I'll take a like 30 seconds, but I'll let you know how much I've taken anyways.
Okay, that was 15 seconds. Let me write that down. Okay. I'm good for cross when you are.
All right, you can have first question.
Perfect. That case, time begins now. Let's talk about your last response on Israel. You tell me you agree that the U.S. veto is shielding Israel, so why does Israel have any incentive for peace negotiations and stopping humanitarian crises?
The argument, I didn't get time to implicate it, but what I was going to say is that with the U.S. veto, they're able to get Israel to actually listen to the United States, and that's why the United States has so much influence over controlling what Israel does in the conflict, which is they're able to stop Israel from like invading Gaza itself.
But hold on, the U.S. veto has always existed and Israel invaded Gaza. I'm really confused what you're trying to argue for, right? Because when the U.S. veto is there, Israel is able to do anything they want because they know that even if they, like, for example, the ceasefire, they didn't listen 22 times because the U.S. vetoed it 22 times.
Yeah, because the ceasefires, as I told you, my evidence clearly tells you ceasefires aren't effective. But what is effective is the U.S.'s influence over Israel, which is why my evidence clearly tells you that when the U.S. vetoes stuff, Israel doesn't want to. When the U.S. allows these resolutions to get passed, Israel kind of becomes like gone rogue and starts doing their own actions that they think is best. But when we stand by their side and do the veto, we're able to coerce them into not invading Gaza itself.
That's not happening though, because the only thing that the U.S. veto is doing is emboldening Israel to do things such as not listen to the ceasefire. But anyways, you can have a question.
Israel wouldn't have listened to the ceasefire either way, but we stopped Israel from invading Gaza.
Let's talk about that since we're on the topic of not listening to the ceasefire. The ceasefire resolution that was recently passed, our War 24 evidence tells you that the only thing the resolution specified was that a ceasefire is important. It didn't actually mandate and enforce the ceasefire with like the military and peacekeeping operations.
Wait, so why does that matter though? Because how is that relevant?
That's the reason that the ceasefire is not working.
Well, okay, then the ceasefire wouldn't be effective either way. It's not because of the veto. It's
because this was not an actual.
That just means that the ceasefire that the UN SC they made was just ineffective, not because of the United States.
The reason is because that's the only way that the U.S. would agree to it. But if the U.S. didn't have veto power, the UN could actually pass a resolution that's actually good and enforces the ceasefire.
No, I don't think you understand our argument. Our argument is that
this is my argument.
No, but I'm explaining my response. You don't understand my response. My response is that by doing the veto, the United States is able to have an open and transparent line of dialogue with Israel, and they're able to use that to prevent Israel from doing severe war crimes and devastating stuff like a full invasion of Gaza.
Israel is already committing war crimes, but you can have a question. We have 30 seconds. You can go ahead.
Yeah, let's. There's 20 seconds left. I don't really have a question.
Okay, that's fine. We can end Crossfire then.
Since I took 15 seconds, I'll just take running prep and then I'll let you know how much I've taken. That was 2 minutes and 10 seconds. The order of the speech is going to be Aff and then Neg with weighing in between. Is everyone ready? Okay, great. Let's start on the affirmative case. They give you a few responses. First, they say that condemnation works, and there are other responses to the veto. First, I would say even if countries condemn a veto, it's not binding because it's the GA. The UNSC and the veto are the only things that are binding, which is why you see so much gridlock in the status quo. Then they give you this massive response about UN collapse. But the biggest mistake they make here is that they concede the two responses that Grace gives you in her rebuttal, where she tells you two reasons why the P5 and a bunch of other countries still will prioritize working with the UN no matter what. The two reasons are, first, because working with the UN is 8 times more cost efficient than working as a country itself. And then the second is the Dyrenforth evidence, which tells you that countries will always prioritize their soft power and international prestige, which they only get through membership on the United Nations. Let's address the responses specifically. First, they say that countries don't listen anyways. Yes, they don't listen right now because the UN has zero legitimacy whatsoever. That's the first reason they don't listen. The second reason they don't listen is because they don't perceive what they say on the UNSC to be equal, which is why that even kills the prospect of action in the first place. But then second, they just try to tell you that never mind. Let's talk about why you're voting for the affirmative. The narrative is simple. Right now, the UN's credibility has declined for years over their failures in the past. Look to Ukraine, Gaza, Syria, Myanmar, etc. All of those countries are still in conflict and have undergone conflict because the UN has been in gridlock from the Security Council veto. They try to tell you a couple things about Ukraine and Ukraine and Gaza. First, they say actually, you can just group all of their responses together. A couple of problems. First, even if ceasefires passed, it took 100+ more days to get around the veto, meaning thousands of people died in the meantime. Second, they say it's not enforced. The only reason it's not enforced is because the UN doesn't have legitimacy. That's why right now, the ceasefire is just saying it's important to have a ceasefire. That's the only thing that could get around the veto, which means it's not actually important, it's not binding, it doesn't do legitimate work. But then lastly, on Israel, the letter of evidence tells you that Israel cannot achieve a peace deal because they see US veto support as the reason that backs them. But let's talk about why you're not voting for the negative. First, on democracy. On the status quo, realize that their own evidence says the margin between autocracies and democracies are getting closer. Nowhere does their evidence say nowhere does their evidence say that democracy is increasing because of the P5. When you look at the actual world, gridlock is all happening because of the veto. But then second, realize that the US will always have allies that are part of NATO and can fight against Chinese hegemony. The thing that's actually strengthening Chinese hegemony is their veto power, because they're able to veto any resolution that goes against preventing genocide or spreading hegemony. For example, in Myanmar. At the end of the day, the UN is not working right now because there's no legitimacy, all because of the veto. History's on our side, and your ballot should be too. For the affirmative, Richard Montgomery.
All right. I'll take like 30 seconds of prep starting now. All right, that was actually a minute, so we don't have any prep left. All right, everybody's ready, I'll start. You should vote on our argument of democracy. It's very simple. Despite years of backsliding, the most recent international analysis concludes that the globe is slowly rebounding back to democracy. However, countries like China continue to spread authoritarianism and pressure developing countries into backsliding. However, permanent membership is the US's most important tool in order to prevent authoritarianism by blocking policies that harm democracy and respond to disinformation, aggression, and human rights violations. Overall, our hard evidence finds that authoritarian nations are more likely to create conflicts which kill millions. Now they make a few responses. However, they don't actually attack our case. The first thing they say is the fact that democracy is still going down. However, no, our evidence tells you that the rate of the democracy decline is actually decreasing and democracy is actually increasing. Overall, even if yes, there's 35 countries still democratically backsliding, if we were to abolish permanent membership, it'd be a lot worse. Now, the second thing they say is the fact that countries are still falling democracies. However, the only reason why they're falling democracies now is because we haven't abolished permanent membership. We say that more countries would be following authoritarian countries like China if we were to like abolish permanent membership. Now, the last argument they make is the fact that China, like the veto power, causes China to pull more countries into authoritarian like rule. However, this is not true. We have told you that yes, China is going to create authoritarian rule either ways. However, our world in which we don't abolish permanent membership is the only world where the U.S. can actually use its veto power and influence in the UN to actually stop these countries from turning authoritarian. At that point, if we win our argument on democracy, we should win the round. That's because democracy outweighs and controls the internal link to 100% of their arguments. Because one, it links into conflict. Authoritarian countries are more aggressive and create conflict globally, which outweighs on scope. That's our car evidence that you should vote on our argument on scope, because yes, they're solving for one conflict in Gaza. However, when democracy erodes and authoritarian countries take over, that causes conflicts all over the world and causes more conflict. Now, the second reason you should vote on democracy is because authoritarian countries undermine democratic institutions like the UN, which turns legitimacy to our side. At that point, let's go to their case. On their case, the first thing on the gridlock argument they've conceded our Ravid 24 card, which tells you if the U.S. did not veto a resolution calling for a ceasefire without conditioning it on the release of hostages, the Israel Prime Minister would cancel planned meetings where they would discuss alternatives to ground invasion of the city where more than 1 million Palestinians are sheltering. That means yes, the U.S. might have vetoed resolutions in Israel. However, you can turn this to our side because that veto was good and it prevented an Israeli invasion on Palestine. That turns your entire case to our side, and that is dropped in their last speech. The next argument that we're going for is the fact that the UN would collapse without like permanent membership, because no P5 country would actually listen to UN resolutions, and that would actually turn legitimacy to our side. To both very good responses. Yeah.
Are you good for Cross?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right. Let's talk about China. So would you say that them conducting genocide is a symbol of authoritarianism?
Probably.
And how are they able to protect that genocide?
What do you mean protect the genocide?
How are they able to keep that happening without international backlash?
I'm not sure. You could probably tell me.
It's through their veto, right?
Probably not. I mean, they have like a bunch of methods to like kind of like cover what they're doing. So.
Okay, here's the thing, right? What you tell me is that the U.S. permanent membership in veto is crucial to ensuring democracy. Why does that not make sense? Because the UNSC and the U.S. is not going to pass a resolution that just says like, oh, all countries have to be democracies. That's not how it works. How it works is exactly how China is making countries authoritarian, right? For example, building infrastructure, giving them a loan, putting them in a debt trap, and throwing like coups, things like that to force them to be authoritarian. And so that type of action is what the U.S. is what we're not able to solve for right now, because if the U.S. proposes something to solve that, China just vetoes it. But China can't veto anything. Yeah.
Yeah, but like you kind of like.
I'm sorry if that didn't make sense. I can explain that clearer if you need.
Yeah, I get your argument, but like our argument is that yes, like China is going to cause like genocides and massacres in either world, right? But the U.S. and its veto power is the only thing that can like kind of like expose those problems.
No, wait, that's completely not true, right? Because if the US were to propose a resolution on the UNSC that says China must stop like genocide in Xinjiang, what can China do? They veto that resolution like they have in the past, and nothing happens.
Yeah, but as we tell you in case, China will not respect any resolution against like authoritarianism or the genocide if we abolish the P5, because then China has zero reason to actually like listen to it in the first place. It's against their interests, right? The only reason China is so vested in the UN right now is because the UN is able to follow China's interests. Once we abolish the P5, the UN does stuff against China's interests. China doesn't want to listen anymore.
Wait, that's not true, because the problem is the way the UN enforces something is not just some guy getting up on a stage and saying, we demand a ceasefire. What the UN does is they send peacekeeping troops there, or they send like military personnel to make sure something is followed through. The problem is that right now
China will allow peacekeeping troops to enter their country.
No, the difference is that right now, nothing is actually effective because the UN has no legitimacy and no countries believe that no countries like feel the need to actually follow it because the veto power causes so much gridlock. That's the difference.
Okay, I would say like, sure, maybe there's less resolutions being passed, but the resolutions are more effective and more countries are listening to it. In your world, there's more resolutions maybe being passed, but no one's respecting these resolutions. So I would say it's quality over quantity. There's no point of more resolutions if no one's actually respecting them.
Wait, hold on. But you made it very clear in your rebuttal that right now no one's listening. And the reason is because UN legitimacy is down.
Either way, that's cross.
No one's listening right now. I never said that.
Okay, we have, I can do math, guys. 35 seconds left, I believe. I'm going to take, if I'm wrong, someone correct me. If not, I'll take that time starting now. Okay, cool. Structure of the speech, it's basically going to go down our argument on veto power and legitimacy, then go on to their case. All right, so it'll be Aff and then Neg. Is everyone ready? All right, time begins now. You should feel comfortable voting for the Aff for Richard Montgomery off of veto power. The narrative is simple. Right now, the UN's track record is horrible because the veto can stop any resolution they try to do to stop conflicts. That changes when you get rid of the veto power and they're actually able to end the gridlock. They only give you 3 responses in their last speech. The first one is they try to extend this response about UN collapse, but they spent about 2 seconds on it and there's no analysis. Remember that insofar as they do not respond to my responses from rebuttal, telling you why countries are still going to be a part of the UN, because first, it's cost effective, and second, because they value their soft power. That means that the UN is only going to get more effective when you remove permanent membership. But second, they tell you that no one listens to UN resolutions. That's exactly what we're arguing for, because UN legitimacy is really low right now because the world sees that the UNSC can't do anything. They can't stop Ukraine. They can't stop Israel. That only changes when you vote Aff. Lastly, they give you this response that's new in summary about how the US veto was great because it protected Israel and Gaza. First, the reason the US vetoed it was because of their own hostage negotiations. And second, realize that right now, Israel can literally do anything because the US will veto any UNSC resolution that tries to tell Israel to stop. That's why you see that the Israel-Gaza conflict is still occurring. Remember, you're always preferring improving UN legitimacy and getting rid of the veto power because it solves for infinitely many conflicts in the future. But then, even if that's not enough for you to sign your ballot for the Aff, you can never vote for democracy. They try to confuse this argument. But remember, China uses their veto to protect authoritarianism. They say in their summary that China spreads authoritarianism because the US cannot stop them. The only way that you actually prevent China from getting more supporters and the global south from voting for them is when you get rid of the veto and the US is actually able to do something. At the end of the day, it's a vote for the future conflicts, a vote for Aff, a vote for Richard Montgomery.
All right. Is everyone ready? Okay. All right, don't worry, I got it. Time begins now. On the weighing, they've conceded that democracy always outweighs because authoritarian countries are more aggressive and they create conflict globally, which outweighs on scope. Their argument is about conflict as well, but they're only talking about Israel and Ukraine. Look at our argument. We're talking about conflict all over the world. If authoritarianism increases, you see more conflicts, you can just turn their impact and give it to us. Also, it turns their case again because authoritarian countries further undermine democratic institutions like the UN, which turns legitimacy to our side. That means if there's more authoritarian countries in the United Nations, the legitimacy of the UN just decreases even more. Because we're winning the weighing, we win any risk of our argument, and on democracy you should negate. Now vote on our argument for democracy. Despite years of backsliding, the most recent international analysis concludes the globe is slowly rebounding back to democracy. However, countries like China continue to spread authoritarianism and pressure developing countries into backsliding. However, permanent membership is the US's most important tool in order to prevent authoritarianism by blocking policies that harm democracy and respond to disinformation, aggression, and human rights violation. We're literally counting China's authoritarian sphere and keeping countries away from that. Overall, our far core evidence finds that authoritarian nations are more likely to create conflict, which kills millions. They say democracy is declining right now. No, our evidence indicates that the rate of democracy decline is slowing down. Even if some countries are backsliding, they would be a lot worse on the Aff. Sure, democracy isn't perfect right now, but democracy would be worse if you abolish the P5. But then they say that China uses the P5 to spread authoritarianism. This is wrong. China will do massacres and genocide either way. We would say it'd be worse in their world because if you abolish P5, China won't respect any of the resolutions that the UN makes. So even if we're, acknowledging the stuff that China is doing, China doesn't care. No action will actually be effective. On the Israel argument, remember the evidence that they completely dropped, where we tell you that it would be a lot worse without the US's veto. Because of the US's veto, we're able to have a clean and transparent line of dialogue with Israel and keep them from invading important cities in Gaza. And then turn again, because on the US collapse argument, they conceded the evidence which clearly tells you the loss of veto power will lead to large powers defying and not actually respecting any of the UN's resolutions, which means legitimacy gets even worse. That means all their arguments of legitimacy can be turned over to our side. Thank you. Great round, guys.
Good round.